This is a presentation on private sector initiatives and opportunities. And as I mentioned with the lead-in, it's going to be where we give you some insight into the discussions we've had in the ISEG on the topic. I will be making the presentation, but the presentation is put together with Nantel Suzuki. Nantel, raise your hand. Nantel has been a big leader within the ISEG in shaping up these discussions, and so I will probably ask for Nantel's help in answering questions as we go forward. So with that, if I could ask for the, oh, I got the clicker, hold on. Okay, great. So the landscape, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anybody, but I'm going to talk through it just because these are things we've talked about with our space agency partners. So there has been significant growth since the last Global Exploration Roadmap was released in 2013, a significant growth in private space exploration activities. There are startups, small, medium enterprises, as well as large aerospace companies that are investing in ideas and products that will play a role in a commercial beyond low Earth orbit activities. There are, you see it, these activities largely in the United States, but we have seen also in Europe an increasing number of small and medium enterprises, as well as startup companies with ideas that will lead to products or services associated with beyond low Earth orbit exploration. And in Japan, there's also a little bit of activity along these lines. So as agencies, we need to be aware of this because it represents a great opportunity, right? It represents a way to bring innovative ideas into the discussion. It represents ways to bring competition and cost-saving products and services to the table. It represents a change in the landscape that we have to understand and factor into our planning. There's also been a recognition that low Earth orbit has been the focus of much of the private sector investment overall. Obviously with the commercial cargo and the commercial crew investments of NASA, but there are other entities that are working on the demand side of the equation in low Earth orbit. So companies and entities that are taking things to space station, like private sector funded research, like 3D printers, just to give some examples. In Europe, there's an external platform that's making its way to the space station. That's a commercial enterprise. So most of the investment is focused on the transportation services, obviously, in low Earth orbit. And what we've talked about within the ISEG is, when will we be able to declare that a private sector driven future in low Earth orbit is really feasible, is really the reality. You heard Robin talk about it yesterday, but how long will government subsidy, government money need to drive the equation? And some agencies are more bullish than others, I'll be honest with you. And you can imagine the U.S. is the most bullish of all in terms of promoting this future. We've talked about how important getting to this point where low Earth orbit is driven by the private sector, and government is just a purchaser of services, because it allows governments to basically have more money available to do the beyond low Earth orbit exploration activity. So we're very interested, everybody is very interested in realizing this future in low Earth orbit. And people have a different view of really how soon that future vision will be realized. Given the beyond low Earth orbit and the low Earth orbit landscape, we've talked a lot about, okay, let's recognize that creates partnership opportunities, and what could those partnership opportunities look like? NASA through the Next Step BAA and some of our other initiatives like Lunar Catalyst, for example. We're using a number of different models in addition to the commercial cargo, commercial crew model to advance public-private partnerships to advance mutual goals in promoting space exploration and activities in LEO, talking to our international partners about what we're doing and why, and the benefits that we're receiving from these new approaches, these new kinds of partnerships, has been interesting. I think it's you're seeing more, especially in Europe, in these days, experimenting with these partnerships, and I think it's largely because there's more of a private investment base in Europe than in other parts of the world, let's say. Yet, hopefully in Japan we can get there, and in Canada and other parts, in Russia, other parts of the globe. But we've been sharing with our partners the kinds of partnership structures we're using and the benefits from those, with the goal of raising awareness and just promoting opportunities that will enable us to together leverage private sector investments for the benefit of the endeavor. The public-private partnerships that are increasingly used, we've been sharing the NASA work. Obviously, we look for cost sharing, and as you know from the initiatives like Commercial Crew, Commercial Cargo, those are cost sharing partnerships. They started out as cost sharing partnerships. Lunar Catalyst, for example, is an example of NASA bringing expertise to the table that can help private sector entities advance their lunar exploration, lunar lander technologies and objectives. We have capabilities as governments to bring to the table for these partnerships, and NASA's leadership in this area has demonstrated that there are opportunities here. Risk sharing is also a topic that we've talked a lot about. I'd say it's something that our international partners are perhaps less likely to take the risks that we are right now. I don't know how to really go too deeply into this, but there are things that NASA has the ability to do and the willingness to do that ends up having a risk-sharing equation that is less burdensome on the partner than would otherwise be the case. And so, for example, we've got the ability to offer transportation services to the ISS. That definitely lowers the burden, the cost on a private sector research entity, for example, so that their skin in the game is less, and they've got a better chance of being successful. But the idea of I'll talk a little bit about it on the next chart, but what role should governments play, and how does that impact what types of partnerships can be realized? And so now to get a little bit more into specific of things we've talked about and messages that you'll see in the roadmap. So we have, through a lot of discussions, got to the point where all agencies are prepared to, all agencies really applaud the increased private sector investment in space exploration. I mean, it is something that everybody recognizes is a very positive influence to the global endeavor. And so, that kind of encouragement in the GER that shows agencies take notice, so agencies are encouraged by this, agencies are welcoming of this trend is something that you'll see. So the role of agencies versus the private sector. You have seen ideas from private sector entities that call for, say, government budgets to be solely dedicated to their idea for something. Let's say, developing propellant depots. I'll use that as an example. NASA should put all of its money into making this effort successful, because then we will end up with a cheaper, propellant depot, a cheaper way to get to the surface of the moon, all these kinds of things. What that kind of proposal ignores is the fact that governments across the world are spending public money, and they have a broad set of stakeholders, right? Their stakeholders are not only industry, and not only a subset of industry. Their stakeholders are also academia and the general public. And so agencies are mindful that their investments in space exploration need to drive new technologies that can benefit their industry, that their investments can create new knowledge for the benefit of everyone. Their investments can inspire and educate, and their investments can extend human presence. So there's a broad, agencies governments when they invest need to be mindful of these, and I think everybody feels like these investments driving economic expansion, economic opportunity is outstanding, and that kind of economic expansion will happen when we've created a situation where there's true markets, and there's competition, and there's supply and demand, let's say. So investing government money for the purposes of enabling one single company to own a lot of intellectual property, or and provide a service which doesn't really benefit the broader industrial base is something that's going to be challenging for agencies. So agencies are willing to invest. What we've talked about is agencies are willing to invest to buy down the risk, to advance operations techniques, understand opportunities which might be taken advantage of by the private sector, and so the main role of government is to do those kinds of things. And if we can succeed in, for example, in going back to the vicinity of the moon, if we can succeed in learning things that identify new markets, if we can succeed in learning and advancing technologies that can be widely adopted to foster this market, then we've succeeded. So that's the kind of discussion that we've been having. I would say that, that's the kind of discussion we've been having. And you'll see some of that in the updated Global Exploration Roadmap, just a high-level summary. There is a broad interest. We laid out with John Guidi and Ryan's presentations yesterday. We laid out these first steps beyond low Earth orbit with the gateway concept and the lunar surface concept, and with that architecture, there's there's opportunities for commercial services. So we talked about would agencies be willing to say, okay, those are services we'd like to purchase from the private sector rather than having an agency provide those capabilities. And these are the things that bubble to the top. So delivery of logistics to the Deep Space Gateway, for example. You know that the crew spending time at an infrastructure in cislunar space will need some supplies. We're hoping to, we won't have the luxury of the supply chain supporting the ISS, but we will need supplies nonetheless, and that represents a good opportunity for a commercial service. Communication services. There are going to be a number of assets, robotic and human, in the vicinity of the moon and on the surface of the moon that would benefit from communications relay services. So the availability of those services is something that people find interesting. And then delivery of things to the surface of the moon. So instruments are early on, right? What you'll hear about today is a desire to do this lunar volatile prospecting and also science on the surface of the moon. And so the delivery of instruments is very interesting, as well as logistics. Ryan's scenario that he described yesterday showed a mobility-based architecture, if you will. The crew would go to a landing site in the lander, and the lander doesn't have the ability to bring the supplies that will keep the crew alive for the duration of the mission, the 42-day mission. So the idea is the first mission, I think, yes. The follow-on missions, the first mission takes place in this reference scenario. After the crew leaves, these pressurized rovers move to a different site. And on the way, they do science and learn information, and they end up at a site waiting for the next crew to come. We envision then having a logistics delivery capability of supplies that the crew can take advantage of that's also waiting for them at that next site. So that represents another opportunity for a commercial services. So a commercial service. So those are the things that we've been able to get consensus on, and we intend to highlight that in the updated Global Exploration Roadmap. That's not to say that those are the only imaginable commercial services. There's a lot of good ideas out there, and as private sector entities look for additional customers, look for create potential opportunities, then that would certainly be welcome. The other thing that we've talked about is joint government-private sector development of space capabilities. So this is not unlike models we've used, NASA has used recently, but let's say there's a capability that a private sector entity can say, look, I have an idea. It could result in a future commercial service. It will benefit you if we could invest or partner in realizing this capability. And those are partnerships that we're open to, and we will describe that in the updated Global Exploration Roadmap. Let me stop here and see, Nantel, do you want to come up and further elaborate on any topics? The next chart is this one, right? So I will let you take an opportunity to say what you think could be elaborated on further, and any other insights you want to share.
Okay.
You can use that turn on. The big button in the middle.
Oh, okay. So this is okay. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, this is a handy chart. Actually, this is borrowed from other folks at NASA. Doug Comstock and others have talked about the role of government and private sector in how do we form constructive partnerships. I think Kathy outlined, I think, the issue and the way we think about potential partnering with the private sector very, very well. In particular, I think one of the key questions out there is reflected in this chart, which is the notion of shared risk along one of these axes, and then there's a notion of where the customers in these markets might come from. To what extent are we talking about governments as the source of demand, and to what extent is there a diversity of customers? And so this is intended as a way to frame or even define what is meant or what should be meant when we talk about commercial space. So commercial, the term commercial is perhaps overused. It has many meanings in the common vernacular, but I think for our context, what's useful is to consider these two dimensions. And let me talk a little bit about, it's labeled business practices, but I guess I'll really, to generalize that, it's really about risk. In the US, we have these terms, firm fixed price contracts and cost plus contracts. But underlying that, and what's useful, I think, generally and internationally, is an understanding that there is, through a public-private partnership model and a commercial model, there's an implied shifting of risks, and it goes in some cases it's risk borne by the government side, in other cases borne by the private sector side. So, for example, we recognize that for an enterprise to get funding, to get investors, and to get off the ground, figuratively and literally, in this case, they're going to need to address a variety of risks off the bat. And we think at NASA we concentrate on technical risks in particular, but there are others as well. There are policy risks, there are financial and economic and market risks, which may be the overriding ones in many cases, and then there are the technical risks as well, and legal risks, policy and legal you might throw in the bucket together. With regard to technical risks, so the government side, you could argue, is in the proper role is to mitigate or burn down a lot of the fundamental technology risks. So we at NASA and our space agencies with whom we work in exploration, we're all in the business of trying to lower, for example, the unknowns regarding, well, we're talking about ISRU, so the unknowns of where space resources are, more generally, unknowns about the space environment. Also unknowns about the technologies that need to deal with that space environment. So all the technology development work. This is a proper role for governments, especially at the lower end of the TRL scale. But once those technical risks are addressed, there's then an expectation that the risks are shifted in some sense to the private sector, and so if we go to a commercial model that's like buying goods at the store, the expectation from the customer is that prices are fixed, and they're advertised, and they're well understood, and they're stable, and the government goes ahead and procures some kind of service or goods, and the expectation at that point is the government's not taking substantial risks. The risks at that point are borne by the private sector. So private sector is offering up this service and stating essentially that they've tackled, with a lot of assistance from the government side in advance, they've tackled a lot of these early technology issues, as well as all the, we've worked out the policy and legal issues. So the sharing of risk it's hard to capture in a single chart, but what this shows is as the further up and to the right we go in this two-dimensional space, the closer we are to sort of an idealized commercial marketplace or scenario. So that's I guess enough said about that chart. But more generally, I think another point to make about the roles between private sector and government, the low TRO work, the low technologies, or the early technologies, that would be amongst the government's, I think, key roles. Like I said, the operational risks and operational execution is the responsibility of the private sector. And so that means that we would anticipate that among the various functions that could be done in an exploration campaign, those that are most repeatable, I would say routine, but nothing in space is really routine, but the more repeatable functions are ones that lend themselves to private sector responsibility. The activities that are really, a one-time type of thing, an extremely exploratory type of thing, lend themselves to government roles. With regard to management of data and information, the government inherently, space agencies are inherently in the business of sharing data. We obviously have a huge commitment to science data, for example. And so in general, there's sort of a promotion of sharing that may not be adopted by the private sector as much. At some point, the private sector will have an interest in retaining data for their own purposes, and that's a natural desire of businesses. So that has to be negotiated some way. But on the government side, in general, we would be interested in promoting open architectures, open approaches to exploration, promoting standards. And so the idea is the government side is trying to create an environment that provides a level playing field and flexibility that allows for a competitive marketplace to flourish in that context. Another difference would be that whereas the capabilities being developed by the government are going to be largely focused specifically on space applications and the space domain, we can anticipate that the choices that the private sector makes to develop certain capabilities is going to be more informed by looking for opportunities to find multiple uses from their capabilities, not just space focused, but space and terrestrial applications together. Another role for the government, we talk about anchor tenancy sometimes, the space station being an example, as Kathy described. The COTS and commercial crew rely on the government being an anchor tenant, providing a long-term stable source of demand. And that's a good sort of bridge towards developing a more flourishing commercial market, and probably is a model that will be applicable in space for some time. Beyond space station, then one can imagine then other types of anchor tenancies or other long-term sources of demand that the governments may provide, whether it's at the moon or anywhere else in space. But I think in principle, our thinking is that but we want to hear from the private sector certainly, but our thinking is that the government can probably help by providing, like we say, some long-term stability in our exploration plans, to be very transparent and open about them, but and also to be working internationally with our partners to demonstrate through things like precisely like the Global Exploration Roadmap, what is in fact the government plan, so that there is some level of confidence by the private sector, by investors, to go ahead and take the appropriate risks on their side. So that's just some of the other themes I would add to what Kathy said.
Okay, thanks, Nantel. So let's see if there are any thoughts or questions. I think in summary, with the Global Exploration Roadmap, this particular one, in the past we've had this Moon versus Mars. What do the governments really want? I think with this next roadmap, you'll see a common pathway. You'll see a willingness of governments to take those first steps, and an interest in governments to help realize the private sector visions and private sector objectives where our interests align. So let me see if there are any questions, and Nantel and I will try to take them together. So in the room?
Hi, Bruce Cahan again.
Yeah, sorry, Bruce.
Good
Yeah.
morning, Stanford. So you've used words like investment and commerce and economy and predictability of supply and demand. Thanks. Thank you. And you talked about sharing data amongst the different international space agencies. Where is there a clearinghouse of the investments, their returns, their risk transfer formulations, their documentation, so that the commercial sector can leverage on an ongoing basis the dynamics of those investments internationally by what region of space, LEO, beyond LEO, lunar, are being made. Do you all have that as part of your data sharing construct for formulating this market?
Do you want to try to answer, or do you want me to? Go ahead.
I don't know we have a great answer there. I mean, in principle, NASA, I'll speak for NASA, other agencies have their own policies, but NASA is very open, certainly, about the science data and the technologies that we develop. The science data is generally available freely, so as we, for example, acquire information about the moon, that information is generally published in scientific forums. It's treated as sort of pre-competitive data and broadly available as part of NASA's charter to make information broadly available. With technologies, there are intellectual property issues, but generally the technologies that NASA develops, if it's done in conjunction with contractors, there are different data rights stipulations, but oftentimes, always the government retains the right to use that data for government purposes, but not necessarily to share those technologies, the technology details with other competitors. So there are some constraints with regard to technology. And there are also ITAR and export control issues as well with regard to technology.
So you've not answered my question.
So let me try to, so the information that might characterize a market or characterize a market. Let me say that. I mean, when we look to establish a public-private partnership with an entity, we will look to see we will ask for information on their estimation of what the potential market looks like, right? Do we keep a database of that? Do we share that? Do we share that with partners? I would say no. I mean, in my understanding, that's basically sensitive information that is considered by NASA in the establishment of a partnership. I think what I think you're getting at is, what kind of quantitative data can be made available to people to help understand really the nature or the health of individual markets, if I'm not mistaken.
You're getting close to what I asked, which is a clearinghouse of the documentation that represents the health of the investments that you are making and the other space agencies are making as part of the GER that says, here's where we have put money, public money, with all the right responsibilities that you describe, and this is how those investments have been matched, both in kind and in cash, over a period of years, not just the episodic, we had money in a budget so we put it to work, but over the period of years for particular capabilities or commodities that will be needed in space. Where is that clearinghouse internationally? And if it does not exist, isn't that something the GER would want to include so we could figure out this chart?
Okay, so I don't know that would be the kind of thing you would put in a GER, right? I think first of all, in the U.S. we've got to I could see the value of establishing such a clearinghouse, as you call it. I mean, I think we're periodically asked account for money that we're putting into partnerships and what are we getting for it. You know, we're periodically asked that by external entities, and it's a fair question, right? I'm not personally aware of a overall clearinghouse. There may be one.
I'm still trying to understand your question. There's you say clearinghouse, which suggests data, but I think you're getting at more than data. I think you're asking whether there's an economic analysis, maybe. I'm not sure. But what I will say is all of the so-called Space Act agreements at NASA, which cover these many of these public-private partnerships, there is a database online that lists all these agreements, and I believe has the dollar values associated with them. And then, of course, all NASA's contracts, I think those are all foilable. I think I'm not sure how easily available they are, but all the individual contracts. So, I mean, the data is available, but again, I'm not sure if that's your question. You're asking, I think, whether there's more than a clearinghouse, whether there's some analytic analysis.
If you're dependent on the commercial development of LEO, and you don't have a assembled clearinghouse to know who's investing in that commercial market, then that's a strategic risk to the country.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, let's talk offline, because I do want to better understand the benefit you see in doing something like that. And so let's talk offline.
Peter Humphreys, and I must apologise, I wasn't here yesterday, so I'm trying to play catch up. The online was a bit spotty, and I just got a complaint from a colleague that it's still spotty.
Oh dear.
So
oh dear.
anyway, he says he's getting
Apologies.
See it now. Okay, so a couple of questions. It's never been clear to me if a company has developed their own IP. Okay, one, how is NASA going to honour that and pay for that IP? That's question one. Question two, for two engineers working out of a garage, writing 58 pages of proposal, okay, is not a trivial thing. And a lot of it can be boilerplates, tick off, we'll sign, we'll do it. Instead of just yards and yards of paper. It's not an easy process. And I know NASA's trying to alleviate the risks, but some of it, it's just like when you go to the hospital, you tick off, you agree to do it. So there's a paper reduction law, I'm not familiar with it, but if we can reduce the amount of stuff we have to write on these proposals, just tick off box, we will do it. We will do the safety boots. We'll wear a helmet. We will do these things instead of writing yards of it, because no one likes writing it and no one likes reading that stuff. So that's the second question. Can we reduce the amount of stuff? I'm being very pragmatic when I'm describing that. And some of these companies, they have proposal writers that they flip it over to Washington, D.C. that makes it sound like Shakespeare. Two guys out of a garage can't compete with that. That's what the big companies do. Now. Okay,
so before we forget your original question, let's stop there for a second.
All right, I've got more.
Okay, do you want to?
Let's see.
Intellectual property. How do we protect intellectual property in a contract?
That's been developed by the company or individual themselves.
They brought to the.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, but I know some. In principle, there's always like an intellectual property or data rights clause in any NASA contract, and in principle, any inventions or intellectual property that exists prior to a NASA contract or partnership is the rights to those are fully protected and retained by the company. In the course of a partnership between NASA and the company, when there's a joint development of intellectual property, then the data rights and intellectual property rights are generally shared. So that's the approach that's taken.
Okay.
On the second question, you're hitting on something that is been on everybody's mind, especially in the last years. The federal acquisition regulations and all the stipulations thereof. Why do government procured systems cost as much as they do? It's because of all the stuff you just described, right? So I think we're always trying to look for ways to reduce the burden, especially, and we understand, your the challenges that a small enterprise has in competing with a large entity that has the in-house capabilities to do all that kind of stuff. I don't know what to tell you. We are not the right ones to take up that issue. I would say, keep addressing procurement officials at various agencies, because all I can do is feel your pain, frankly. So, did you have one more question? Because then we want to get some online questions.
Yeah, I turn over a root canal doing 58 pages of NASA proposal. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So because I wasn't here yesterday, I've got a couple of questions. All right, pertaining to the deep
could we
space.
do those offline then? Because we'll be here. We're going to take a break in a minute.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna we can address those questions if you don't mind.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. John, are there questions from the online
Yes.
space, the virtual space?
Yes, we have a few. One from Aaron Ostero. Apologies for the name if I didn't get that correct. A question is, how do we prioritize the stakeholders in this process when making decisions given the diversity of stakeholders?
Okay, so I described the stakeholders of government, so academia, industry, private citizens, and the various types of benefits that we seek to benefit those stakeholders, political stakeholders. How do you prioritize stakeholders? I would say it is an art more than a science. You try to recognize that, do an in-depth understanding, an in-depth analysis of what their needs are. You've heard of needs assessments, and understand their needs, and you do the best to include those needs in your mission planning. We don't try to prioritize them because, in general, right? Because that creates a situation where benefits may not be delivered to other stakeholders. So, we've had this discussion a lot, even with our international partners over the years, on the importance of delivering benefits. It used to be that in the U.S. at least, that human space flight was important because heck, we put man on the moon, and it's who we are, and NASA had the full support of the government to do the missions that we wanted to do. Okay, more or less. I'm taking some liberties there, but now in this day and age, it's really important that we are better able to articulate the benefits of our proposed programs and projects to the range of stakeholders. So we try to balance those benefits as best we can. So again, it's an art more than a science. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Not sure about the context of the question, and unfortunately we can't have the back and forth dialogue. But we're talking about public-private partnerships, commercial. So by stakeholders, if you mean companies, actors in a market, then and how do we prioritize stakeholders or actors in a market? I would say NASA will contract with companies that have the technical capabilities and are competitive on a cost basis as well. So market principles would apply to some extent. By stakeholders, if you're asking how do we prioritize between again what governments might do, what space agencies might do versus what industry might do. Again, I go back to what I said earlier, which is I think we'll have to work our way through questions of, say, which functions are highly repeatable. Providing communication services might be something that's, like I say, lends itself to the private sector. Forging ahead to the exploration of new territory on the moon or Mars or something like that that's never been done before would be something that probably space agencies would do. So I'm not sure exactly what scope of stakeholders we're talking about here, but that there's some prioritization schemes there between governments and the private sector.
Next question.
Okay, the next question we have is from Martin Elvis, and looking a little bit down the road, but remaining in low Earth orbit, and that is about Are there any concepts or ideas for NASA or other U.S. government agencies like Institutes of Health or Science Foundation becoming anchor tenants on commercial LEO platforms?
Okay. You heard from Robin yesterday that, how do we ensure the availability of LEO services long after the ISS is something that's actively being discussed, and how much government investment is required to ensure those services remain available. Obviously, we'd like it to be, we'd like to not have to be an anchor tenant. We'd like to see a post-ISS platforms available, meeting our needs and services capable of being purchased. Whether, so I would say, there are not any, the future remains to be seen. We're committed to the availability of LEO platforms for doing the research that we need to do, the technology demonstrations we need to do, the astronaut training activities that we need to do, and what governments are prepared to do to help ensure those capabilities are available is a topic for the future, I think. Okay, is that?
We have another question, also from Martin Elvis, and he pointed out that not all technologies in aerospace are developed purely within governments. Private industries are doing a really good job. In fact, the reusable launch vehicle is one area that they're doing really good in. So in this new environment, how do you prioritize, or how do you make decisions on what the government does in-house versus seeking technologies outside of the government?
Well, a lot of the technology development NASA has done through a shared basis. So, for example, in our office, we have a series of solicitations that require shared cost and shared assets be provided by the government side and the private side. So what we're looking for is, you mentioned RLVs. So the first question to ask would be whether whether NASA has a need for that capability in our given budget constraints and priorities, and if and when we do, then we certainly put out solicitations for those technologies. Right now, our office, I'm from Advanced Exploration Systems. We don't have any RLV investments at the moment. NASA has done those historically. That has gone up and down. If the private sector, on the other hand, sees a business case for themselves to develop it, then then we assume that they have private investors backing them, and then the question then would be, would the government be interested in buying services from that kind of commercial venture? And we very well might, but we would want to see evidence of that market emerging first.
Okay. All right. Anything else in the room? Anybody hear anything that alarms them with where we're heading? What kind of things you're going to see? I'm looking to a couple people in the room who I know would be okay.
Okay, back here, Alan DeLuna.
Alan?
And we've worked this kind of chart many times in the past in the different kinds of forums and things, and it's a reasonably beneficial chart to understand, some of the decision processes. I've been doing versions of commercial versus government work since 1986 and trying to get those things put together. I would suggest that the left chart, the cost plus shared risk and firm fixed price, is really not the way to look at the pricing and the cost of things. And I can tell you that, and we've got to look at it differently, both from the contractor or the private entity standpoint and from the government standpoint. A little war story is the best way to give you an example. The very first commercial contract that United Space Alliance did was for some people developing a launch vehicle. Went off and did some work for them. We got paid for it, and when my business manager for the corporation looked at it, he said, "You made 30% profit. That's not acceptable. We have to go back and give them money back." and knock our profit down to 7%. That was because they were very used to working in the government FAR constrained environment where you control or you worry more about profit than you do about product delivery. Some of the folks that have worked in this in the past have said that if you stop trying to limit profit levels and worry more about just what the total price is, what is the total price, and get away from cost plus and shared risk and all of that, just look at total price and figure out if the total price is what you want to get, and get away from a 4-inch binder, 2 or 3 4-inch binders of cost data when you're receiving proposals, then you'll get more things from the private industry, and you'll get more better production of what you want. I understand FAR constraints, I understand Space Act agreements and all of that. I understand some of it's bucking against the trend, but it's not just the government we have to go off and cause to do it differently. We have to cause the companies, the large companies, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Grummans, and those folks to come in with the same kind of ideas and say, we need to get away from this way of thinking about pricing and get to a more simpler pricing like we do in commercial work.
Okay, thank you.
Just a comment. Yeah, I agree with the sentiment, and I think what we're trying to do with some of our new initiatives is base pricing on like you say, have a simple basis for them. So, for example, we're talking about transportation of payloads to the moon. It's one of our initiatives we're focusing on closely. And indeed, our question is not, we're not asking providers to, show us reams of paper about how you've developed these capabilities to send stuff to the moon. We really just want to know what's the cost per kilogram. So we want a commercial transaction, if you will. That's relatively simple, and we have no however much profit is earned in the process is really of no concern to the government in this context. We're interested in working with a competitive marketplace and getting the best value for the government.
On the contracts we've done before, it was 20% skin in the game. Through various means to help other advocacy, we saw the Congresswoman, it got reduced to 10% skin in the game. That's still a lot of money for 2 guys out of a garage. When you're going to reduce it down to like 2.5 or something that's reasonable. We've done a lot of R&D. 10% is still a lot of money for 2 guys out of a garage, a couple of engineers.
Okay, so thanks everybody for the inputs and the questions in this session and the discussion. Appreciate it. We're going to take a break here in the room and get some coffee, and we will start up at as advertised on the agenda. So 8:35 local, and you know what time that is in your time zone. So talk to you in a bit.